Hello, and thank you for joining us. On behalf of XQ Message and Carahsoft, I would like to welcome you to today's webcast, OMB, FISMA, and CISA Zero Trust Data Compliance, Insights from Federal Cyber Experts. Now, at this time, I would like to introduce our moderator for today, Brian Wayne, CEO of XQ Message. Brian, the floor is all yours.
Thanks so much, Kara. And thank you, Carousel, for having us. We're very excited to be here with AWS, Bob Gourley, and uh, with Junaid Islam from XQ. Just to start it off, I'm Brian Wayne. I'm the CEO here at XQ Message. We're a zero trust data governance platform. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker today, which is Bob Gourley. Bob Gourley is the ex-CTO of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He is also runs a network called UDA, which is a group of former intelligence officers and agents, and they provide advice to governments and Fortune 500 companies. Bob has a storied career. He's one of the highest ranking intelligence officers in the US government presently. He's worked on everything from advising presidents over the last several decades to uh, breaking a few spy rings as well. Bob, can I turn it over to you to introduce yourself?
Oh, Bob, is your mic muted? Or
Yes, thanks, Brian, for that very kind intro. I wanted to clarify that I have spent now, 40 years in or around the intelligence community. I break that into three chunks that are relevant to this discussion. I have three different careers, really. The first career was as a Navy intelligence officer, and my kind of intelligence was focused on bringing all the right data together to make assessments to drive decisions. And I leaned heavily towards security of that information, but making that information usable was the mission. The last 4 years of that career was focused on intelligence support to big DoD cybersecurity missions. So that got me even deeper into defending against adversary attacks, learning the best practices for defense, and working as a team to secure large systems. My second career was as an enterprise chief technology officer. I did that at TRW and Northrop Grumman, and then also back in government at the Defense Intelligence Agency. I left about 12 years ago, 13 years ago now, and been on my third career as a technologist in industry, working with a lot of startups and bigger companies and working with teams to help secure large enterprises, and also working and advising back in government. And in this last career, it's forced me to continually learn also because there's so much exciting things going on in security, and we're going to talk about some of them today. But the threat is also growing dramatically. So that's me in a nutshell. But let's talk about zero trust. You know, the term zero trust really got popularized in, say, 2010 when John Kindervag kind of coined the term while he was at Forrester. But we had been using zero trust designs in the intelligence community for quite a while. So let me just give you some context there. Imagine back to the early days of intelligence and Department of Defense, national security communications. You have a communications circuit and you know you have to encrypt it because the adversary will listen into it. How do you do that? You need an encryption key on both ends. How do you get that there in a trusted way? In the old days, you send people with courier bags to all of your endpoints and load that encryption key. And you have to do that because you need to trust that network. But how do you trust the couriers? Well, you make sure they're vetted and good people, and you put the encryption key in a sealed pouch. But even that, sometimes those pouches would get stolen. So how do you trust that? Well, through years and years of evolution, those networks got bigger and more complicated. They got to be truly networked using IP and other telecom routing protocols. And all along the way, the DoD had to improve its ability to communicate in the presence of adversaries in a way where you do not trust any endpoint. It was done extremely well, and by about 2005, the Department of Defense, specifically the intelligence community components of the Department of Defense, were building zero trust capabilities into their networks. And then also DISA took that and built that into their secret networks with something they called the Black Core. So to me, that was the early foundations of this zero trust world. And what is zero trust? I love the practitioner's definitions, so I'm going to want to ask you, Brian, and Derek, and Junaid for the real definition of zero trust. But for me, it is really trust no device until you have truly authenticated and identified and authorized it to communicate. And do not give your data out to anybody unless it is in that zero trust kind of architecture. And keep the data encrypted and keep your own keys so you know who's using that data. To me, that's the essence of zero trust. Now, another thing I'd mention, there's a lot of vendors in this space. A lot of people have components of that zero trust, but a lot of establishing zero trust is configuring what you've already got or smartly using the best from industry in ways that are integrated and work together. I went on quite a bit there, but that was my intro and background and a little bit of my view of the history of zero trust. So comments, context, what did I get wrong there?
Oh, you got it all right. That was a great start. That was a great start. We'll introduce Derek, we'll introduce Junaid, and then we'll come back to some of the core fundamental problems around cyber right now, where it's failed. Talk a little bit more about some of the places it's been successful, especially with Zero Trust. But for the moment, I'm going to introduce Derek Doerr. He's from AWS. He's the Zero Trust lead for US Federal. Derek, please introduce yourself.
Sure. So, as Brian said, U.S. Federal Zero Trust Security Lead for our technology and innovation team within AWS. Been here about 8.5 years, and like Bob, I've gone through probably several different careers, at least three that I'll count major career shifts. And the interesting thread among all of them is a focus on things at scale. So starting with in-vehicle telematics, 20 plus years ago, almost 30 years ago now, progressing to message level processing, supporting everybody from telecoms and banks and pharmaceuticals, then later the intelligence community and defense. That progressing into things like how do we support customers, migrating large numbers of workloads into AWS? What does that governance framework need to look like? How do they address compliance requirements? And so the flip side of governance compliance has always been security. Once you get the framework in place, and now you have the mechanisms, and you've got the foundation to then really roll out security at scale. And so that really brought me around to zero trust and how that really applies to our federal customers, how we work with partners to deliver on zero trust principles across the organization. And then, of course, more internally is a focus on promoting within AWS our security culture.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Derek. That was great. Now I will introduce Junaid Islam. He's the CTO here at XQ Message. He's also the inventor of software-defined perimeter. Junaid, do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for Derek and Bob for joining. So, Bob's intro was kind of interesting and funny. And of course, being an intelligence officer, it did have a hidden meaning, as you would expect. So when he was talking about couriers long time ago, delivering packets and opening packets, actually, that was my job. I started I used to build these networks during the President Reagan's time, and that's exactly what I did. And what Bob kind of doesn't know, or maybe does know, and why the DoD had to really improve zero trust is the couriers were supposed to do the network, and the network guys didn't know the stuff. But what actually happened is everybody was so confused, they would all get together and trying to figure out what's going on. So I'm sure they figured this out in the Pentagon, and they said we've had it with these courier guys. But I've been involved in networking a long time. But unlike Bob, never achieved any status. So I've done protocols. I did MLPP, which is used in the Patriot launch system. Did mobile IP at net-centric warfare, and did come up with software-defined perimeter. I was a contractor at CIA Science and Technology for Bob Flores, who's Bob's other partner. And I think what we're doing here at with AWS is very important. As you know, the threats to the United States are not slowed down. In fact, a big part of President Trump's statements during the campaign is to strengthen manufacturing in America, strengthen the national security ecosystem. And a component of that is ensuring strong communications, protection of data. So I'm happy to be here with AWS and Bob to talk about this kind of very important topic today.
It's excellent. Thank you so much. Bob, I'm going to come back to you. We are at a place where there are some really intense compliance requirements around zero trust, around FISMA, around CISA. How do we get here? It seems like we keep losing the data. What's the importance of cyber, and why has it failed in the past? And why are these compliance regulations, why have they been put in place?
Okay, so that's some big questions. And let's go back to the analogy of the old days, just because it's a simple use case to talk through. Back in the day when we had to send couriers with encryption keys to all these different places, yeah, like Junaid, that was a solid approach. It should work. But every once in a while, someone would lose it. There's the famous case of the Walker and Whitworth spy ring in the Navy, where encryption keys were actually being given to adversaries, which let them just right into your perimeter. Now, let's go to the modern version of that. Too many of us built up defenses around the network side with strong firewalls and thinking then that, well, that's going to keep the bad guys out, when actually you may have an insider, a Snowden or someone else who's inside your firewall, or any intrusion from the outside that gets in via any way, whether it's manipulating someone through social engineering or brute forcing into something or guessing credentials. They become like an insider because they get past that perimeter and they're right into your stuff. So that makes these zero trust approaches just so much more important. Every major breach can be traced to a handful of avenues in. According to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, there's really just 10. So if you look at these and you look at what zero trust designs and configurations and technologies can do for you, it can really make it harder on the bad guys. So that's the key reason to do it. And then, Brian, you mentioned compliance regimes. The reason we have these compliance regimes is because we need to measure and test and help people configure things the right way. Now, sometimes those become onerous and they're there for a reason. If we design simply in the right way, we can quickly produce proof of compliance. And so that's kind of the point I wanted to make about compliance. It's there for a reason, whether it's commercial compliance regimes or federally mandated compliance regimes, or even CMMC. And if you're working with DoD, it's there for a reason. But if you do it right, you configure things right, you can document your compliance and make that compliance a bit less painful.
Yeah. But it's certainly challenging, right? It's challenging from a cost perspective, from just it's complicated, right? None of this has been very easy. And Derek, I think that AWS has been working on this problem quite a bit and trying to make it simpler, trying to make it more cost effective. Like, how does AWS approach this, and what's like the methodology that they recommend for solving this, specifically
So,
with trust?
so we've been working as we've grown our environment in the past several decades now. There's been a real high premium placed on security of our environment, what's on our side of the responsibility model, but also providing a lot of tools and assets for customers to really secure their environment inside the customer's part of the responsibility model. And along the way, what we've also seen a lot of is, we spend a lot of time looking at what's going on in the outside world and understanding that the traditional approaches to security largely have failed. Very commonly, the approach was, again, defense in depth. Let's add another firewall. Let's add that crispy outer shell. And what happened was that once the bad guys figured out ways of getting in, and they're increasingly doing this, they can all of a sudden start moving laterally. And once they move laterally, they can then cause all kinds of mischief, but they also persist in the environment. The bad guys have gotten very, very good at getting into an environment and lurking there for days, weeks, months at a time before they're even detected. Most of the recent breaches that you've heard about in the news, the bad guys were inside those environments for long periods of time before they became known as a threat. Okay. All of a sudden, your data disappears one day. You do the forensics and realize they got it 6 months ago. So, and in a lot of cases, especially with malware, the bad guys are actually staying around after ransom is paid, and they come back again because they're never really left. So we really take an approach towards zero trust as being a substantially better security model, but that's really what it is right now, right? It's a security model. It's a way of thinking about security, that and related mechanisms around security to provide controls around digital assets. Those controls, though, don't give you a benefit of the doubt because of where you are on the network. And so, just simply VPNing into an environment, just simply having a connection into an environment doesn't endow you with certain amounts of trust. We want to make sure that every step of the way, things are being authenticated continuously, authorized continuously, assessed continuously. So that every transaction that comes in should be reassessed on, things like device posture, time of day, geolocation. Maybe there's a data dip into an HR system along the way as part of building up that zero trust score that then determines when you get to a policy enforcement point, is this transaction, does this GET request, this PUT request going to be allowed into the application? And then once you're in the application, now you need to go further and say, is this user trying to access data through this application? Are they allowed to do that? Do they have the clearance level necessary? Do they have the job responsibility that warrants them accessing this data? And so along the way, we really kind of structure this around a number of principles. And the first one is that it's not identity centric or network centric. It's actually both. Okay. It's a merger of identity and network controls. So you're continuously reassessing what's going on with the user, with their device, and the network they're on right now and where they're trying to go to. The other next thing is really working backwards from use cases, understanding what are you trying to do, because you can't boil the ocean. Okay, where do you start? You can't, if you try to do everything all at once, it's, software engineering tells us you're going to fail. I mean, decades and decades of history tell us you're going to fail. So what are your use cases? What are your key outcomes? Work on them and work on them iteratively. It's not a big bang approach. It is it's a continuous process. One size doesn't fit all, and that is that you may be looking at various compliance frameworks. In the case of DoD and CISA, they both have published frameworks for federal government use. And what you still see in a lot of cases, though, there's going to be things on each of those frameworks that may simply not apply to the application you're working on, the workload you're working on. Some of the big things in the environment, sure, they will. Things like, do you need a SIM? Do you need a SOAR? Do you need, certain other components? Absolutely. Do you need to work on macro and micro segmentation? Absolutely. But your specific application may not need all of those things. In fact, it may not be possible to do all of those things. Shocking as it is, there may be lots of COTS applications around for which you don't have access to the source code. So you simply can't do certain things within the context of that four walls of that application. Okay. So one size doesn't necessarily fit all. And then finally, kind of start from where you are. A lot of organizations already have a lot of parts and pieces in place in their environment. They've already got identity providers in place. They've already got zero trust network access in some form or another. They've already got the firewalls in place. Don't rip out the firewalls. Leave them in place. They're well known. They're well understood. They're useful for certain contexts, but they can't be the only security mechanism. So you want to work backwards from where the customer is, understand what their environment looks like, understand their gaps. Once you understand that, now you can work forward to say, okay, let's work on what are the two or three most important use cases, and let's also begin looking at prioritizing the workloads in your environment. Which ones are good candidates for modernization to fully adopt zero trust controls that are worth it? Okay, the menu application for your cafeteria probably isn't worth remediating and spending $100,000 on. And missile control system, on the other hand, absolutely.
So that they're not trying to steal the pudding recipe from the cafeteria. That's good to know. I like that. It's iterative. You're looking at the gaps. That's great. Thank you. Junaid, we talked a little bit about approaching this from an application standpoint, approaching it from a network standpoint. But certainly there are controls and there are requirements around the data as well. And I mean, they do keep stealing the data, it seems like, rather than the network. Junaid, how would you approach zero trust at the data level?
That's a great question. I do want to encourage people to ask questions on the Q&A box. I see some of the participants trying to raise their hand, so I think you have to, if you put your question in the Q&A box, we'll answer it. But to answer your question, I really want to build on Derek's statement, which was really about how at AWS, what they've really done is integrate all these different zero trust components. And the reason that's critical is you can, of course, buy any number of zero trust products, but linking the identity system to your access control system, to your logging system, to your file encryption system is either very difficult or next to impossible because you're buying finished products. So what AWS has done a great job is pulling together security stacks for VPN, for endpoint protection, and integrated them. In that context, what we're doing is the data piece. Now, so the thing you might say is XQ just doing file encryption. Isn't that everywhere? Why do you need XQ? The difference between XQ's file encryption, there's two important things. One, it's a policy-based file encryption, so you can make the policies as simple or as complex as you want to. And again, to Derek's point, to fit what the customer needs, to fit what the situation is, how comprehensive. XQ is able to do that because its policy-based controls are all API driven. So this can be linked, say the government client, for compliance reasons, needs access to files based on identity or policy. They can now do that with XQ, where XQ will not release the encryption key for a document, even though they're in the environment, right? Because they don't have the rights for that document. Similarly, we can link it to other policies. One of the most common compliance policies is a geolocation, either state specific, if they're working at a state level or they're licensed, or certainly within the United States. So that's an example where we can use the geolocation coming from the laptop identity system. Where's the users, where's the laptop, connected back into the identity system, and either unlock or keep the document locked. So the key thing about zero trust data and why it is so different than, say, file encryption, again, is the ability to do very complex policies linked to other systems. But here's the nice thing, from a user perspective, it's all transparent. And that's important. The users don't have to learn this. I mean, if they want to learn about zero trust architecture, that's great. But if they don't want to, as far as they're concerned, this is kind of invisible. And I think, given, what's happening here with the new White House, where they want to restart manufacturing in America, invest big in R&D, I think a lot of the things we're doing here with AWS are very timely in terms of, providing very sophisticated security at a very cost-effective price point.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it sounds like you're talking about data as sort of the connective tissue, the ability to string together the systems that you already might have. So if you've got, XQ talking to Splunk, talking to CrowdStrike, and then being able to say like auto quarantine within Okta, something like that, make that automatic, and then build on what you already have. That's really great. Bob, bringing it back to you, you've seen a lot, obviously. Like you're in there on a daily basis. If you were going into an agency or going into an organization and they had to become zero trust compliant, what's the first thing that you would do? What's the first question you would ask them to get them on their journey along the way?
Some of these agencies are very large and very complex and have multiple subordinate organizations, multiple networks, and some of them have just an uncountable number of data stores. Just echoing what Derek said before, there's likely a lot of zero trust type approaches already. So I think the initial conversation, if it's a large government organization, is let's do an assessment. What do you have? What do you not have? And a lot of that's verbal at first. You talk to people who really know what's going on and get a feeling for the lay of the land and what is protected and what's not. And then usually we end up zooming in on the data. You know, what is your data? What are the crown jewels? How do you protect that when it's at rest and when it's in motion? Because the data is the target so frequently. And then what do you do with that data? Does it have to go to multiple systems because multiple use cases, people rely on it and they need to run it in different applications? Where do you store it? How do you grant access to it? Those are the kind of questions that then lead to the right conclusions of, hey, how do you implement that in a secure way? What's the full stack of capabilities to protect that data, whether it's on-prem or off-prem, or it's a combination of cloud and on-prem? So that's the general approach is, coming in verbally at first, talking to experts, and then getting a good inventory of what's going on and how to protect it.
Great, thank you. Derek, in terms of use cases, what are some of the use cases that you're helping solve for within AWS, especially like the Zero Trust Accelerator for government, and that particular stack? What are some of the use cases and the components that you've put together for AWS that you're most excited about, especially with the outcomes you're delivering?
So probably among them is going to be things like data exfiltration. Okay, that's a very key use case for us to focus on. Who's accessing the data? How are they moving it around the environment? And how are they actually removing it from the environment? If they are, if there's a pattern that indicates they are, how do you detect that? How do you stop it? But it's not just a matter of stopping it in one component. Junaid mentioned a second ago the idea that, okay, so through XQ you can detect that something's happening, you can stop it, but they can also turn around and feedback that signal to other parts of the environment, like Okta, like CrowdStrike, to say we're now going to put this, we're going to quarantine this user, we're going to block their access, their zero trust score has been diminished until somebody from the SOC or somebody from the security organization can come in and understand what is going on with that particular user. Is this a benign activity or is it something more malicious? And then take action on that based on that. A lot of it comes down to working with, what can you do with AWS natively? And there's a lot. Okay, as I mentioned, we've been working on security controls, building them into our environment as a base component of our services, but also things that customers can use when they stand up their environments. Everything from, we didn't talk about it years ago in this context, but security groups or a stateful firewall, they're effectively a micro perimeter. AWS accounts are effectively in one form or another macro segmentation, right? So we have these concepts that have actually been there for long periods of time and are now kind of formally aligning to various frameworks and so forth. But along the way, we also recognize that there are some things that we don't do, and we probably never will do. And so understanding that, we work with partners like XQ and a variety of others to put together a best-in-class set of components, a set of ISV partners that really deliver on a whole range of use cases in the zero trust space. And what's interesting here is that we're really not trying to do it all ourselves. Okay, there's the idea that, there are best in class, best in breed partners out there that do different parts, that address different parts of the story, and we can bring them all together and they can work together in a standards-based way inside the environment. So it gives the customer a lot more flexibility. It gives them a lot of control over their environment, and it also reduces concentration risk. If you're buying all of your security tooling from exactly one vendor, and that one vendor has an issue, you've got an issue. So this way, you've got a whole variety of, again, a layered approach. There's diversity in the architecture. There's diversity in the ISV selection, and there's better, that results in a really much better way of addressing zero trust requirements.
Excellent. Thank you. So we have a couple questions. One specifically for you, Derek. And Lindsay, please forgive me if I mispronounce your name. I think it's Lindsay Hebert has asked regarding AWS tools, and this is a little bit of an overlap of what you were just answering. regarding AWS tools for sophisticated security. Could you please elaborate on the tools, services you are using in the AWS stack for Zero Trust and also for network services? For example, AWS private link services, et cetera, working or supporting Zero Trust. And then secondly, what are the best practices and what are the needs to ensure both connectivity services as well as Zero Trust? That's a big one.
That's a big question. Okay, so a couple different parts there. What kind of services are we using around Zero Trust specifically? Um, Quite a number. So very fun. There's a lot of very foundational primitives, certain things like KMS and Cloud HSM. Effectively, Cloud HSM plays a big part of the story in terms of being able to use externalized keys or key material and store that and bring that in, perform all the necessary audits around that, control who can access key material for encryption, decryption purposes, but also things like threat detection inside the environment. So, guard duty is a fantastic capability to understand what's going on in your environment. Guard duty is constantly looking at all the signals from all over your cloud estate and across all of your various accounts and looking for patterns that are unusual, looking for patterns in real time that indicate something bad is happening or just something bad just happened, and then raising those alarms. Now, you certainly need to then feed them over to a SIEM environment. So you've got things on AWS like Security Lake, for example. It becomes a great concentration point for all that data to then be fed into either doing your own analytics or feed that into something like a commercial SIEM offering like Splunk, for example. So now you've got the whole ecosystem, and you've got a whole lot of controls that you can also build in the environment. Guardrails, for example, from a service called Organizations, where you can determine, at a high level, what services, what parts of the environment are your developers, your admins allowed to work in. If your restriction says, I can only operate in continental United States, there are ways to lock that down so that no one can go and build things outside of the US. If you're in a heavily regulated customer environment and you want to be able to lock down which AWS services are being used, let's say you only want things that are FedRAMP High, for example, or DoD, SRG, IL5, you can lock those things down so that other services aren't available for use, or so you maintain your compliance that way. Um, so then going forward, can you refresh me on the last part of that question? There was a long question there.
Yeah, what are your best practices and what are the needs to ensure both connectivity services as well as Zero Trust?
Okay. So what are best practices is a very, very broad topic. It kind of depends on what we're talking about and which part of the environment we're talking about. Certainly turning on things like Guard Duty and Security Hub right from the get-go. Security Hub will turn around and it'll ingest data from Guard Duty. It'll also pull data. It'll also do things like start checking inside your environment. You can say, my environment needs to be compliant with SP5 853, and it'll run a whole series of controls all over your environment, consolidate information, let you know, hey, here are the things that indicate you might have challenges in your environment. So turn those things on at a minimum. But also things, really pay attention to the fundamentals. First and foremost, start with the fundamentals. How are you authenticating your users into the environment? Use an IDP, use multi-factor authentication components. Whether you're using a CAC or a PIV card, using a YubiKey, you need something more advanced than ID and password. Again, these are very foundational, fundamental things, but then you've also got to continuously reinforce and look at them. So a lot of this goes back to managing users properly, and there's a lot of guidance on this. For AWS customers, they can work with their account essays. For folks who aren't yet customer, they can certainly there's an enormous amount of available documentation on our website to support that.
Excellent. That was a very thorough answer. That was good. I think that one of the big issues that folks have around Zero Trust and compliance, security in general, is just like the level of effort. I think what's also interesting about this conversation and the solution that we talked about is it's a Zero Trust stack, but that is great for government, both on the DoD side and the FedCiv side, but it also applies to other critical infrastructure and everything that DHS and DISA care about. Including education. We have a question from Gregory Genge, and I'm going to direct this to you, Junaid. I see that XQ has already developed this into a number of use cases, but what would be the effort to integrate this into any application like PowerSchool? PowerSchool was recently hacked through their S3 bucket. They were recently breached. And would that integration fully protect any application it was built into?
Oh, well, that's a great question. So today, we of course have Bob Gourley, and we're talking really about both government customers and as well as companies that sell to the U.S. government, sell to the Department of Defense. But all the concepts we're talking about are actually useful for a broad range of use cases, everything from medical to financial to education. So I want that is very important to internalize that. So in terms of linking to specific applications, one of the great things we've done with AWS is make this transparent to applications running in AWS. That's really important. So as everybody knows, developing applications is really where the big money goes. You're hiring developers, you're working with your customers or your customers' customers, you're finding it. The last thing you want to do is change your application because you need security, right? What we have done in partnership with AWS is create a zero trust stack that's actually transparent to applications. So when we go and we, using XQ, encrypt your S3 bucket with and protected with policies. Say a policy is, can only be used by, your employees within the United States or a specific site or after they pass. That locking down of the data in the S3 bucket is actually transparent to the application. So as everything is aligned, the application will work. If there is an either intentional or unintentional policy failure, that's when we basically lock it down, right? So this is really important. And one of the big things I want people to really kind of internalize, especially after Derek's very fantastic response where he talked about
Good.
all the things he was doing, is it's next to impossible to hire a team with people like Derek to do everything that you could just buy as a service. So it's a lot easier. I mean, so the important thing is that if you didn't understand all of Derek's response, that's the whole point of this. You don't need to understand. You could just buy it and it's all done. But definitely one of the nice things about Zero Trust is the transparency. It's elegance, right? You can slip in policy-based access control, geofencing. You can put it in role-based with your older app and basically give your older or existing apps a security upgrade. And that's a very nice aspect of using a cloud-based security stack.
Yeah, and now just to interrupt and underscore the point of compliance, you need to comply with OPM mandates, you need to comply with FISMA, you need to comply with all these other things as a government agency, especially. This transparency makes the compliance so much easier.
Bob, it's like you have a psychic ability because I was going to ask you something just like this next, which is essentially, real world examples. There's an enormous amount of controls and restrictions that folks need to implement. There are, just the realities of dealing with government, and sort of the entrenched I won't say interest, but the entrenched decisions that people have made in the past. How would you move forward with this? Like, and who's done it well? Like, when you think like these guys, and maybe this is more of an approach to just the methodology rather than the technical solution. But who's done it well, and could you give any real world examples around that?
I have a lot of real world examples in the commercial sector and government,
Great.
but there's pockets is the way I would describe it. Like if you look at the FBI, they have been on a 10-year journey to improve security and defensibility of their systems, and I believe they're doing it very well. Secret Service also. The White House famously was intruded upon, and ever since then, they've realized they have to continuously improve. White House Communications Agency is doing things incredibly well, from what I understand. In the Department of Defense, it's such a big organization. It's an organization of organizations. It's 22 major agencies, and then there's all of the services and their subordinate organizations. it's hard to pinpoint the ones that are doing it best. But I've seen and heard a lot of progress at places like, well, DISA helping others do this, and then Defense Logistics Agency. The combatant commands all have their own capabilities that are extremely important. Another place that's doing it well are those that are on the DevSecOps innovation side, and the innovation groups, AFWorks, SpaceWorks, Kessel Run, the organization that's running Cloud One and the many capabilities you can tap into there. So there's a lot of pockets where great work is being done. But I think it would be better if I kind of now shift to Derek and ask Derek if you're okay and authorized to say who some of the best users of a zero trust end-to-end integration using AWS are. Is it possible to talk about your users? I know a lot of folks like confidentiality.
Yeah, I won't be able to reference a whole lot of folks directly. What I can say is that there's a whole lot of activity going on in some very innovative approaches to leveraging zero trust. For example, things like a tactical edge. How do you apply things to an IT and an IoT and an OT environment as we're beginning to make real strides in locking down parts of DoD, for example. The next major hurdle is going to be IT and OT, or IoT and OT. It's the weapons platforms themselves, it's the vehicles, it's the forward operating bases. And taken in a broader context, when you start looking at CISA's mandate, when you look at what they're doing, is really not just federal government, but it's also 16 different critical infrastructure industries. Among them are things like energy sector. And where we see a lot of useful use cases in there is beginning to lock down, and effectively hardening sensor networks. Consider pipeline, for example, power distribution. All those rely on sensors that are in many cases decades old. They were never really anticipated to be operating in an environment like they are today. The threat environment just wasn't even on the horizon at that point. So applying zero trust principles to a lot of that data as it's coming in, all of a sudden can begin to really reinforce the environment, but also helps us understand where the threat actors are, and identify them earlier, and then remediate them, get them out of the environment earlier.
You know,
Excellent.
I actually want to build on what Derek kind of said and Bob talked about. So, one thing we've talked about is how zero trust, or more importantly, the way we've implemented it in AWS is transparent, which is a big issue for government agencies who all have legacy applications. But here's one of the interesting things. One of the biggest things happening on the private sector and the government is AI. And, when Derek talked about IoT data, one of the biggest users of IoT data now is AI. So you have an interesting dichotomy. Very old sensors, for energy, for oil wells, gas, out in the field, coming in, they need security. They need to be upgraded, right? Moving into the cloud, where you're creating these massive data lakes for AI programs, which also need security. Now, if we start using different security stacks, this becomes a nightmare to implement, but next to impossible to converge. However, if we are using zero trust stacks, zero trust data to grab the IoT data, lock it, make sure only the authorized legacy application can see it, but also the brand new authorized AI application can see it. This is a massive simplification for the security team at either a government agency or their prime contractor, who's got to pull all these people in, right? And if you think about AI itself is a gigantic ecosystem of startups with different models. We're going to bring it in to the AWS environment, being able to give them policy-based access to different parts of the data lake, whether they're creating new models or looking at legacy systems. This is much simpler in the architecture we're talking about, versus imagine Imagine having to buy 20 to 30 different products. You'll just never get there.
Junaid, you've just taken the AI genie out of the bottle. I think that I now have to ask Bob and Derek what they think about that as well. Obviously, huge push in AI this year, huge push within the government, even within the last like couple months around AI, big developments there. Bob, what do you think are the main things that people need to be aware of, just implementing AI for government, for education, for commercial as well? How do you protect that data? How do you protect the data is in, the data that's coming out, and how do you keep it compliant?
Yeah, big topic. And so government's been working with AI for 30 years, a lot of machine learning. There's so many old algorithms. Then the new algorithms are being used in government too. But the big change, of course, is the large language models and this world of generative AI that the government also wants to take advantage of. To take optimal advantage, you need to put your own data there. So you need your own, finished intelligence products or finished research or a finished logistics report, depending on what your missions are, and make sure you got the right data that you're using there. Your architecture might be a RAG architecture where you are making sure your queries are being responded to by your data itself. Therefore, you minimize hallucination. But it all comes down to whether it's a finished document or report or some other kind of data. Make sure that's your data that you're querying. So it's if you're using other big systems like OpenAI or others, Anthropic, still make sure that you're protecting your data by making sure it's under control and making sure it's not just somebody violating policy in your organization and sending a document or data someplace it shouldn't be to let some big system query it. That may not apply with your policy. So, big question and hard to answer in a comprehensive way, other than to say it all still comes back to your data. How do you make sure that your data is encrypted and protected, and your own people can't violate your own internal data policies by accident, sending your data off other places? Then what about the results of that AI?
Hmm.
How do you trust it, and where do you store that, and who do you send that to? And that becomes your data.
Well, that seems like you're opening up more questions than answers there, Bob. But
Yeah.
no, I see what you're saying. That's I mean, I want to direct this to Derek as well, and then we have two other follow-up questions. I want to make sure we're able to get all these in the next 9 minutes here. So Derek, and actually Derek, I'm going to make it a little harder for you. AI, how do you protect that data? How do you protect your insights? And then, but also, how do you do that from the edge, not just in the cloud?
Yeah. So AI, interesting love-hate relationship, right? On the hate side is the fact that the bad guys can now use all kinds of AI tools to find better ways to get into the environment than ever before. That's a fact. On the love it side, so can we. So your red teams, your purple team, they can go ahead and do all sorts of things to use AI. Now it requires some different skill sets, but that's just a matter of a little bit of learning here to understand. How can we leverage AI to effectively break in new and unique ways, and then guard against that. On the purely defensive side, using things like generative AI, using architectures like RAG, like Bob said, you can turn around and get better insights into, is there a threat actor in my environment? What's normal, what's not normal in my environment? The amazing thing about a cloud environment like AWS is that you have so much telemetry about what's going on at any given point in time. You've got all this data that is just an incredible context, right? Sifting through and using it all is challenging, or can be challenging. Feeding it into a sim, assuming that you're asking the right questions, can be great. Where generative AI comes into play, though, is going to that security lake, that CloudTrail lake, running up against a commercial SIM provider, and saying, "Hey, what are the needles what are the dogs not barking? What are the things that are happening in the environment that we should be aware of, but we're not yet?" Okay, it's that sort of thing that we need to be able to identify. Now you're getting closer to being able to head off that zero-day attack and close the gap from initiation of the attack to remediation of it.
That's a great answer. I have another big one from Lindsay here, and this is, I think, regarding IAM solutions. So Okta versus AWS versus Azure versus GCP for multi-cloud. How do you support specifically enterprise customers' need for VPCs within one or more clouds across that AIM, CIAM gap, right? And what are your recommendations for tools and capabilities? CrowdStrike, CyberArk, Palo Alto. It's not a small question. Cisco ISVs, but in terms of like a multi-cloud environment or a hybrid environment, even like on-prem to cloud, like how would you approach this with zero trust?
So in a especially in a multi-cloud, I mean, let's face it, many organizations today are hybrid and multi-cloud. Okay, almost everybody has some form of SaaS offering for office productivity, for campaigns, for video. Okay, in that respect, everyone's already multi-cloud, running workloads in lots of places. You're certainly going to be multi-cloud. So what you do need is things that are, at that high level component, right? That can handle your enterprise-wide identity federation. But then tying that into, what are the things that are unique in each cloud environment? Passing the appropriate tokens over to the cloud environments, it understands, aha, this user is Bob. Bob has certain permissions. But oh, by the way, Bob is also coming in with a token from, let's say, CrowdStrike or another EDR solution that says his laptop is up to date and he's sitting and is transmitting information that says he's in the continental United States and X, Y, and Z and all the other factors, right? So now you can take all that collectively and begin to make policy decisions against some rubric to say, do we allow Bob into the network in the first place? Can Bob route from where he is now through a zero trust network access solution to get to the front door of the application he's trying to reach? And then is that application, has that app been brought up to modern, if you will, security standards? Is it an old application? Is an old COTS application where the best you can control and the best you can do is control messaging in and out of it, and it's going to do its own thing with respect to role-based controls, for example? Or is it truly a modern application where it's going to understand that every single GET request, every single HTTP request in and out has to be authenticated, authorized, and re-examined? Okay, so you've got a whole range of different applications. So a lot of it comes down to understanding, the broad strokes of your environment, coming up with some common approaches to handling this problem. Because you don't want to have, three different DevSecOps approaches, for example, across your environment. You effectively want one that can understand the nuances of where things are going to deploy. You don't want three different IDPs. You need one. Okay, so understanding what those things are, but then how they integrate into the native components in the environment becomes very important.
Hey, Derek, you fired another neuron and you made me think of something that I think a lot of people don't understand about AWS, which is you can actually run any of these LLM models in AWS using your Bedrock. I know. So all the major models are there. Your own model, AWS model, but you can run Anthropic. You can run their Claude model. You can run Llama, which I like because of their open source and open weights.
Yep.
So if you do that, and now you have this end-to-end zero trust solution with XQ that's protecting your data. It has a full stack of identification and identity management and authorization and access to any LLM model you want.
Very true. Yeah. So we've got a lot of in-house models, including our new Novo models, but also you're right. There, most of the major third parties are out there. If you want them, chances are pretty good you can find it on AWS. Yes.
Very nice. All right, we've got time for one more. I believe that this is a little bit more on the commercial side. I'm going to direct this to Junaid. How do we implement zero trust frameworks that protect our most vulnerable citizens while creating connections rather than constructing barriers?
So
How do
that's
we
a great
ensure?
question. And I'll just do it quickly because we're going to run out. So the question is, if you're either a government agency or a contractor and you are collecting data on citizens, whatever, how are they using water, how are they using energy, what's the traffic like, is there value to zero trust And the answer is yes. And it's actually pretty significant. Everything Derek has talked about is automatically audited in the system. So that is, the access is audited, the decryption by XQ is audited. They all create forensic level audit trails. The great thing about this is if you are handling data of US citizens, you keep the data secure, but you publish the audit logs publicly back to the citizens to give citizens the comfort that their state or government agency or the contractor that the state has brought in to process whatever is protecting their data. That is a very nice feature. It's free because remember, you're just taking the audit logs that AWS is creating. There's no identities of the people, but it's showing that, oh, you're in the state of Indiana or you're in Florida. Look, there's nothing leaving Florida. And we might have had an inbound connection outside of, but look, the system is rejecting it. You can see the rejections at the access control, at the encryption layer. This is a very nice thing that I think I hope people will start using because nobody thinks of logs as useful. But in terms of public policy to ensure trust through transparency, this is a great thing and probably worth a webinar in its own right.
You're probably right about that. All right, this has been amazing. Final thoughts, Derek and Bob. We've got just a little bit of time here left. If you want to just impart your last bits of wisdom to us.
What an exciting time for enterprise technologists because you can tap into a full-scale end-to-end solution. XQ works well with everything else you've got, works well with all your data. It works well with AWS. So what a strong partnership. So this is great news for enterprise technologists.
I'm going to piggyback on that and say that we're very grateful for XQ's work with us or our other partners in terms of really helping building out, improving an environment where we can have these various integrated solutions put together. Where we effectively filed away all the sharp corners and pointy edges and or reverse that. Sharp edges and pointy corners, and come to an environment where we can say, okay, now we know it's provable that we can say these things will fit. These vendor partners will fit together very well. There is a high degree of assurance that customers can now have that we can make them work together properly. It's not just take my word for it. It's been done. It's been proven. And we now can effectively move forward. That it takes a lot of the friction out of the process and helps customers get to that better state.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Junaid. This has been amazing. I'm looking forward to the next conversation we have. Kara, did you want to wrap it up or are we at the end?
Yes. No, just wanted to say thank you to everyone for your participation and for joining us today. We hope that you found this webcast informative and helpful to you and your organization. Please take a moment to answer the questions on your screen. We appreciate your feedback. For those who met the CPE requirements today, you will receive your certificate of completion within 2 weeks. And if you have any further questions or would like to request more information, please feel free to contact us. Our contact information is currently being displayed, so please don't hesitate to call or email us. And finally, in the next day or two, we will be emailing you all a link to an archive version of this webcast, along with a few additional resources, so you can review it or pass it along to a colleague. Thank you again for attending.